It was the summer of my junior year in high school, and my friends and I were looking for something to do on a Friday night. We decided to have a sleepover at my friend Emily's house, who lived on the outskirts of town in a secluded area surrounded by dense woods. Emily's parents were out of town for the weekend, so we had the whole place to ourselves. As the evening went on, we watched movies and ate junk food. We laughed and joked, enjoying the freedom of being away from our parents for the night. It was just a typical sleepover. Nothing crazy really went down. But as the night wore on, we began to notice strange noises coming from outside the house. At first we shrugged it off as the wind rustling the trees or an animal roaming the woods. But the noises persisted, growing louder and more unsettling. It wasn't long before we heard some rustling right outside the windows, and we knew that something was definitely not right. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the sound continued, growing louder and more frantic. Finally, I mustered the courage to investigate. I slowly crept over to the window and cautiously peered through the blinds. What I saw made my skin go pale. There, standing just outside the window, was a figure dressed in tattered clothes. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out its wild, messy hair and the creepy, disturbing eyes. I stumbled back, tripping over my sleeping bag and falling to the ground. My friends woke up, asking me what was wrong. I struggled to find the words to describe what I had seen, but before I could answer, there was a loud banging noise on the front door. We all froze, too terrified to move. The banging grew louder and more insistent, and then we heard a voice calling from the other side.
"Let me in, please let me in."
We huddled together, too frightened to respond. The voice grew more frantic, and there was a loud sound of glass shattering. It had broken the window beside the door, and we could hear it screaming even louder. We all screamed as the figure from outside burst into the room. It was a woman, her hair matted and wild, her eyes filled with an insane intensity. As we backed away, we saw that the woman's clothes were bloodied and she was holding a knife. We realized that she must have been an insane person who escaped from a nearby hospital or something, and was most likely dangerous. I saw a glass vase on a table right beside me, so I grabbed it and threw it right at her head. The vase broke and the crazy woman fell to the ground, dropping the knife. We then overpowered her and called the police, who took her back to the hospital. We were lucky to have escaped with our lives. In the aftermath of the incident, we found out that the woman had been a victim of a traumatic event that had led to her mental illness. But the memory of that night still haunts me. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones that are real. My friend Alex and I were having a sleepover at my family's remote cabin in the woods. Now the cabin was fairly small, with just 2 bedrooms and a kitchen with huge windows. We had told our parents we were staying at a friend's house in town, but in reality, we were miles away from civilization, surrounded by dense forest. We were both excited to have some time away from our parents and enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. The wind howled outside, making the trees sway, and the rain pounded against the roof and windows with a force that made the whole cabin shake. We tried to distract ourselves by watching movies and playing games, but we couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched. Every time lightning flashed, I thought I saw something move outside, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. As the night went on, the storm only grew worse. The sound of rain hitting the roof and windows was deafening, and it was hard to hear anything else. But then, we heard something that made our blood run cold. It sounded like someone was tapping on the windows, trying to get our attention. It was very distinct, like in a pattern. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just a branch hitting the glass, but the tapping persisted, and it was only getting louder. We both sat frozen in fear, not daring to move or even breathe. The tapping grew more frantic, and we could hear someone mumbling. We knew we had to do something, so we decided to call the police, but when we tried to dial 911, we realized that the phone line was dead. We were completely cut off from the rest of the world, with nowhere to call for help. That's when we heard footsteps outside the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, and they seemed to be circling the house. We knew that whoever was out there was dangerous, and we had to protect ourselves. We searched the cabin for anything we could use as a weapon, but we couldn't find anything except for a small pocket knife. We were both shaking with fear, knowing that we were no match for whoever was outside, but we decided to make a run for it anyways. We burst out of the cabin and sprinted towards the woods, hoping to find some shelter or help, but the storm was so bad that we could barely see anything in front of us. We stumbled through the woods, trying to escape from whoever was chasing us. I couldn't help but wonder who or what it could be. Was it a person or a wild animal? We didn't dare look back, but the footsteps were getting closer and I could hear heavy breathing coming from behind us. I felt like my heart was going to burst out of my chest and my legs were aching with exhaustion. Finally, we reached the cabin and quickly barricaded ourselves inside. We huddled together in the dark, listening to the sound of the rain beating against the windows and the wind howling outside. From the looks of it, it seemed pretty beaten down and abandoned. The windows were cracked, spiderwebs in every corner, and some markings and graffiti on the walls. I felt a sense of relief wash over me as we caught our breath and tried to calm down. But that relief was short-lived when we heard scratching noises coming from the door. As the storm raged on outside, we could feel the tension building inside the cabin. It was as if whatever was outside was taunting us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Hours passed, and the storm eventually cleared up. We stayed huddled together, too scared to move or speak, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. It was only then that we dared to move, slowly and cautiously towards the door. As we peered through a crack in the barricade, we saw that there was nothing there. The scratching marks on the door and the growling noise we heard had disappeared, as if they had never been there at all. We were left with more questions than answers, and a feeling of unease that we couldn't shake off. We made our way back to our cabin, which had been completely destroyed by the storm. As we looked around, we couldn't help but wonder if it had been the storm that destroyed it, or something else entirely. Regardless, we were relieved that we went with our gut feeling and left the cabin when we did. Otherwise, we would be seriously hurt if we stayed in that cabin. We knew we had to tell our parents what happened, but we also knew they would never believe us. It was a secret we would keep to ourselves. As we left the cabin for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees, waiting for us to return. I knew that this experience would stay with me for the rest of my life, haunting me with unanswered questions and an unshakable sense of fear. I went to my friend's family farmhouse. It was such a cool old house that had been in their family for generations. We were so excited to explore it and see what it was all about. We set up our sleeping bags in the living room and started munching on snacks while chatting away. That's when my friend's little sister started telling us this spooky story about a local guy who went insane after his family passed away in that very house. We all laughed it off, but I gotta say, it did make me feel a little creeped out. Later that night, we were all playing Monopoly when we heard some strange noises coming from upstairs. We all froze and tried to listen harder. The noises just kept getting louder, like someone was walking around. My friend said it might be her cat, but we didn't think it could be a cat. Eventually the noises stopped and we tried to shake it off by watching a movie. But to be honest, I couldn't really focus on anything but the creepy feeling that was in the air. We all went to sleep a little while after, and then in the middle of the night, I woke up to this loud banging noise. I sat up and tried to figure out what was happening, and that's when I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. I thought it must have been my friends, but my friends were all asleep right in front of me, so I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 as quietly as I could. The police told me to stay online and stay quiet. That's when I heard a man's voice muttering to himself. The footsteps were getting closer and closer to where we were sleeping. I was frozen in fear, my mind racing with different scenarios. The footsteps grew louder until I could see the shadow of a man looking outside the door. Suddenly the door to the living room burst open with a loud bang and a man stumbled in. He looked like he was in his mid-50s with unkempt hair and ragged clothing. His eyes were glazed over, and I could smell the stench of alcohol on his breath from where I was sitting. He stumbled over to the couch where my friends were sleeping, muttering incoherently to himself. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I tried to stay as still as possible. The man stopped by my friend's sleeping bag and leaned over her, his breath hot on her face. I could see her stirring, but she was still asleep. The man then began to move towards me. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing with thoughts of what he might do to me. The man was now standing directly in front of me, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. He swayed back and forth. I could smell the alcohol on his breath again, and it was much stronger this time, and it made me feel sick to my stomach. Suddenly he lunged towards me, and I screamed at the top of my lungs. My friends woke up and startled by the commotion. The man stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and falling to the ground and hitting his head. My hands were shaking uncontrollably at this point. The police arrived shortly after, and the man was arrested. It turned out that he was a neighbor who had been drinking heavily and had stumbled into the wrong house. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't called the police in time. It's safe to say that I would never go back to that farmhouse again. I was having a sleepover with my friend in my parents' house, which was right at the edge of a huge forest. It was a quiet and peaceful place, but the fact that it was the only house in miles made it a little bit eerie. My parents were gone for the weekend, leaving us alone in the house. We had been drinking a little bit, even though we were underage. It wasn't too much, but it was enough to make us feel a little buzzed. As we were settling down to sleep, we heard a shuffling noise outside. We thought it was just an animal or the wind, but the sound got louder and more distinct. We got up and went to the window, looking out into the darkness, but we didn't see anything. Then we heard a faint sound that sounded like someone was trying to open the front door. We thought maybe it's just the wind howling outside or something, but the sound persisted, and it became clear that someone was trying to get into the house. We froze, wondering who could be trying to get in. We knew that my parents had locked all the doors and windows, so we had no idea how someone could be trying to break in. I slowly walked towards the door to listen more closely. I could hear someone jiggling the doorknob, trying to force it open. I quickly ran back to my friend and whispered, "Someone's trying to break in. We need to call the police." Then we both realized that we had been drinking, and calling the police would only lead to more trouble. We knew that if we called the police, our parents would find out, and they would be mad as hell. So we decided to stay quiet and hope that whoever was trying to break in would give up and leave us alone. We turned off all the lights and hid in the back room. For what seemed like an eternity, we heard nothing. But then, we heard footsteps outside, and we knew it was the same person from earlier trying to get inside. Suddenly the sound of footsteps became louder, and it was clear that someone was outside and they were trying to sneak around the house without being seen. And then I remembered the back door wasn't locked. My friend and I stared at each other wide-eyed. We rushed to the back of the house and closed the door just as we heard the sound of the back gate opening. The rest of the night we stayed up, checking the doors and windows constantly and trying to remain as quiet as possible. Every time we heard a noise, we would freeze, wondering if it was the person trying to break in again. We stayed up all night on guard, checking the doors and windows constantly, but we didn't hear any more noises after that. The fear of what could have happened if we hadn't acted quickly still lingers in our minds to this day. I woke up on a Saturday evening, feeling a rush of excitement as I prepared for a night of adventure with my friends. We had been planning to explore the abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town for weeks, despite the warnings from our parents and locals. They had told us it was a haunted house, but we laughed off their concerns, dismissing them as silly superstitions. As the sun began to set, my friends and I gathered our sleeping bags and snacks, ready for the night ahead. We made our way through the overgrown fields and past the rusted fence, feeling a sense of anticipation growing with each step. Finally, we arrived at the crumbling farmhouse. As we stepped inside, a sense of unease settled in our stomachs. The air was thick, with a musty scent of decay and neglect, and the creaking floorboards and peeling wallpaper to make it very eerie. But we pressed on, determined to uncover the truth about this allegedly haunted place. As we explored the decaying interior, the darkness seemed to close in around us. The shadows grew longer, and the old wooden floorboards creaked with every step we took. Flashlights flickered in the gloom, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot, and the silence was broken only by the occasional sound of an animal running away through the shadows. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, we pushed on, determined to see what lay ahead. But then, as we reached the top of the stairs, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps below. Fear crept into our hearts as we realized that we were not alone in the abandoned farmhouse. We held our breath as the sound of footsteps grew closer and closer. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. As we huddled together trying to calm ourselves, we heard the sound of heavy breathing coming from the other side of the door. Exchanged nervous glances, wondering who or what could be making such a noise. Suddenly the door burst open and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was an old man, dressed in tattered clothes and holding a rusty saw. His eyes were wild and bloodshot, and he seemed to be speaking gibberish. We froze, unsure of what to do. The old man lunged towards us, swinging his saw wildly. We screamed and ran, trying to find a way out. We stumbled through the dark, our hearts racing as we heard the old man's steps echoing behind us. We could hear him shouting, but we couldn't make out the words. Finally, we burst through the front door and ran into the safety of the moonlit field side. We looked back towards the farmhouse and saw the old man standing in the doorway, watching us with a look of madness in his eyes. We caught our breath and tried to make sure of what had just happened. We realized that we narrowly escaped a dangerous and disturbed man. The warnings we had heard about the abandoned farmhouse had been more than just superstitions. We made a pact to never again venture into such an unknown and potentially dangerous place.